The judge laughed, loud, smug, and cruel. "What's the matter, soldier?" He sneered across the courtroom. "Lose your voice along with your thoughts?" His voice echoed off the high ceilings, drawing scattered chuckles from the gallery. In the witness box, the royal guard didn't move. Dressed in his scarlet-red tunic, tall black bearskin hat tucked under his arm, Isaac Ward stood like carved stone, silent, composed, eyes steady on the floor. The judge leaned forward, clearly enjoying himself. Or perhaps you're only trained to stand still and look pretty. Another wave of laughter. But not everyone found it funny. Across the room, a woman in a black blazer quietly raised an eyebrow and made a single note on a folder marked "Confidential, Royal Integrity Unit." She looked toward Isaac, not with sympathy but with expectation. He gave nothing away. No twitch, no glance, no reaction. And yet, the energy shifted. Somewhere in that silence was a warning, a reckoning, because Judge Edward Langston didn't know who he'd just mocked. He didn't know what was about to be unsealed, and in the next few minutes, it wouldn't be the royal guard under scrutiny. It would be him. Long before that courtroom echoed with mockery, Isaac Ward had learned the value of stillness, not as absence, but as discipline, as armor, as legacy. From the time he was a boy watching the changing of the guard through Iron Palace gates, Isaac had dreamed not of medals or glory, but of standing where men never flinched, where silence meant strength. His father had served too, a quiet, principled man who taught him that you don't raise your voice to be heard, you raise your presence. By the time Isaac turned 18, his posture was sharper than most officers' commands, and his eyes carried a calm weight that made even commanders blink. He passed every test with mechanical precision, but what stood out wasn't his physical prowess. It was his ability to remain composed when everything around him cracked. In the years that followed, Isaac rose through the ranks of the Queen's Guard, always silent, always steady, always watching. What few knew was that beneath his unshaken presence stood a man who had witnessed more than his oath required. Protests, crises, private palace moments never meant for public eyes. And still, he never spoke, until one day, quietly and without fanfare, he was tapped for a classified internal detail. The Royal Integrity Unit, a small, off-the-books group tasked with observing from within, watching the watchers, so to speak. Not investigators, not soldiers, observers, trusted not to act unless absolutely necessary. But when they did act, it was final. Now, standing in that courtroom, Isaac wasn't just a silent witness. He was carrying an unspoken file of truths the man mocking him had no idea were circling just beneath the surface. Judge Langston, for all his robes and rhetoric, had spent years building a reputation as sharp-tongued and politically bulletproof. What he didn't know was that Isaac had been present, silently positioned in ceremonial detail, at 3 separate hearings that involved missing funds, questionable dismissals, and unusually sealed outcomes, all under Langston's gavel. Isaac never filed a report. He didn't have to. He had waited, watched, memorized. The courtroom that day wasn't just a legal forum, it was a crucible, and while the judge reveled in the echo of his own laughter, Isaac stood like he always had. Silent, but not passive. Not this time. As recess was called and the judge stepped away with his robe flaring behind him, Isaac remained where he was, still, present. Behind him, a plain-suited woman approached quietly and slipped a folded document into the hands of the royal legal observer in the corner. It was thin, unassuming, but it carried weight. Inside were dates, times, and testimonies collected over years, not by journalists, not by politicians, but by the quietest man in the room. And now, as the court prepared to reconvene, the question was no longer, why isn't he speaking? It was when will he finally be heard? When court resumed after recess, the judge returned with even more theatrical flair, robes flowing like a cape behind him, eyes scanning the room with smug control. He relished the spotlight, fed off the deference in the gallery, the quiet fear in the clerk's posture, the way attorneys stood too quickly when addressed. This was his stage, and today his ego was the performance. Isaac Ward stood exactly as he had left him, motionless, hands clasped behind his back, uniform immaculate. But now something about the room felt tighter, like a rope slowly winding. Langston didn't notice. He rarely did when the discomfort wasn't about him. "Let's get back to our royal ornament," he smirked, flipping through papers with exaggerated annoyance. "Mr. Ward, or is it Sergeant? I forget your title. Do you have anything useful to offer this court besides posture?" Another snicker escaped from a man in the gallery. The judge didn't correct him. "Perhaps I should ask the palace for a mannequin next time. At least that won't waste taxpayer pounds standing around looking pretty." Still, Isaac said nothing. He didn't shift, didn't blink. His silence wasn't empty. It was weighted. And Langston's voice, louder now, bounced off walls like a hammer trying to crush something unbreakable. But not everyone was laughing. On the far side of the courtroom, the royal legal representative, Mrs. Eleanor Voss, leaned forward, her fingers steepled under her chin, eyes studying Langston, like a surgeon waiting for the moment before the incision. Next to her, the court officer who had received the discreet folder during recess adjusted his posture. Subtle, but alert. There was no movement from Isaac, but the shift had already begun. Langston just couldn't see it. "Tell me," the judge continued, turning slightly toward the gallery now, as if performing, "how does one get a job like yours, Mr. Ward? Wear red, look stoic, and pretend you matter?" His chuckle echoed. It was forced, louder than necessary, the kind of laugh that tried to drown out tension he didn't quite understand. A young woman in the gallery, a university law student by the look of her, raised her eyebrows, unsettled. She nudged the classmate next to her. "Isn't that one of the ceremonial guards? From the Queen's procession," she whispered. The classmate nodded, slowly. "Yeah, I think that's the guard." Isaac's name had been in no headlines, but his face, people remembered. The silence that day, the moment he stepped out of formation and placed a hand on the Queen's coffin, a gesture that made history in a whisper. The judge turned back toward Isaac, exhaling loudly. "Very well. Since you've nothing to say, we'll move on to witnesses who understand how courts work." "Your Honor," came a voice. Calm, professional, it was Eleanor Voss, rising slowly to her feet. She held a file in her hand. "Before we proceed, the Crown has submitted a supplemental packet for urgent review." She paused. "It concerns your previous rulings and your conduct over the past 4 years." The judge blinked, once, then twice. The room froze. No one laughed. Isaac didn't move. But this time, he didn't need to. For the first time that morning, Judge Langston didn't have a response. The name Eleanor Voss alone was enough to still the room. She wasn't just another Crown attorney. She was one of the monarchy's legal architects, a woman whose reputation was built not on volume, but precision. She spoke only when everything had already been decided behind the scenes. And now she stood before him with a folder in hand, her tone devoid of emotion, her presence cutting through the judge's ego like glass through silk. Langston blinked again, clearing his throat. Supplemental packet? He reached out for it with fingers that didn't tremble, but not for lack of trying. Eleanor walked forward, laid the file gently on the bench, and returned to her seat without a word. Inside were 4 documents, each tied to sealed rulings Langston had issued in the last 3 years. each involving mysteriously missing exhibits, oddly suppressed testimonies, and financial records that should have raised alarms, the kind of quiet manipulations a man in power might think buried for good, but someone had been watching, remembering, recording, someone who never said a word, until now. Langston skimmed the first page and felt the heat rise behind his ears. Names he recognized, dockets he'd forgotten, numbers he couldn't deny. "This is out of order," he muttered, stalling. "This is highly irregular." But his voice didn't carry the same weight anymore. Whispers stirred through the gallery, not the curious kind, but the uncomfortable ones, the kind that signal the mood has changed, that the man who once commanded attention was now under it. Court officers exchanged glances, professional, unreadable, but suddenly tighter. The clerk stopped typing. One of the guards at the back took a small step forward, subtle but clear. He wasn't guarding the court. He was guarding the people in it. Isaac Ward hadn't moved, but his presence was different now. No longer background, no longer dismissed. The weight of his silence had been lifted by something heavier. Truth, and he wasn't the only one who knew it. Eleanor leaned toward her assistant and whispered something that made the young woman's brow furrow. She stood and quietly exited the courtroom, returning moments later with a sealed envelope marked Confidential Judicial Ethics Review Board. Langston saw it from the bench. His face remained composed, but his hand clutched the edge of the folder just a little tighter now. Let's move on," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "We can address this later in chambers." But no one was listening the same way anymore. Every eye in the room had shifted, not to Isaac, not to Eleanor, but to the judge, watching, measuring, waiting. And that's when it happened. A low vibration from under the bench, his court-issued phone. One glance at the screen, and Langston's jaw tightened. It was a name he never wanted to see flash during open session. Lord Hadley, Royal Oversight Committee. His world had changed, and he wasn't the one steering it anymore. Meanwhile, Isaac Ward slowly turned his head. Just slightly, just enough, and looked directly at the man who had spent the morning mocking him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because power had shifted, and everyone in that room felt it. Judge Langston adjusted his robe for the third time in less than a minute, each tug less about neatness and more about nervous ritual. The courtroom was still, but it wasn't quiet. It vibrated with something new, something thick and unspoken. Eleanor Voss sat stone-faced at the Crown's table, her hands clasped, her eyes unmoving. The sealed envelope marked Judicial Ethics Review now sat beside the clerk's monitor, unopened but radiating weight. Langston cleared his throat and forced a smile. Let's not let theatrics derail today's proceedings. Mr. Ward's statement is irrelevant to the case at hand. But the confidence he was known for, sharp, biting, dominant, had softened into something almost brittle. He didn't realize it yet, but his attempt to regain control was only drawing more eyes, more questions, more silence. The court officer standing beside the exit moved slightly, adjusting his earpiece, and everyone saw it. That subtle shift meant someone else was listening now, someone outside those walls. In the gallery, cell phones buzzed discreetly as headlines began to circulate. An investigative journalist sitting quietly near the back typed 3 words into her notes: "Judge under review." She hadn't planned to write about the guard. Now he was the centerpiece. Then Eleanor stood, not slowly, not dramatically, just enough to still the air. "Your Honor," she said, her tone firm but professional, "we request a formal pause in these proceedings due to the potential conflict of interest concerning your past rulings." Gasps didn't erupt, but eyes widened, chests tightened, Langston straightened sharply, his voice rising an octave. "That's absurd. I have presided over this court for nearly 2 decades without question." "Without question," Eleanor interrupted gently, because the right people stayed silent. She didn't look at Isaac when she said it. She didn't have to. Langston's face darkened. "This is a coordinated smear attempt," he spat, pointing a finger. "I know how this game works. You parade a royal guard into my courtroom and act like his presence gives you power." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, not dramatically, but with purpose. A man in a gray suit entered. Tall, mid-50s, trim, royal insignia on his lapel. He didn't speak, just walked directly to the clerk's bench and handed over a letter. The clerk opened it, read silently, then stood. "By order of the Royal Oversight Committee," she said aloud, her voice clear. "This court is hereby placed under temporary suspension pending investigation into judicial misconduct. Judge Edward Langston, you are to recuse yourself effective immediately." No one breathed. Langston froze, lips parted, hands still gripping the bench. For a moment he looked small, not because his robe had shrunk, but because the room had grown beyond him, beyond his reach, beyond his rules. Isaac Ward, still in full ceremonial uniform, stepped forward, not to speak, not to confront, but simply to exit. As he passed the bench, his gaze didn't waver. He didn't gloat. He didn't blink. He just moved with the same unbreakable poise he'd brought into the courtroom. But now, every person in the room knew what that silence had been hiding. Power, truth, memory. Langston slumped slightly against the bench, the sting of his own voice from earlier echoing in his head. Perhaps I should ask the palace for a mannequin next time. No mannequin had ever unseated a judge, but a silent man had. It didn't take long. Within an hour of Judge Langston's removal, the video clip had gone viral. Not the official court footage, that was sealed, but someone in the gallery had caught it. A shaky phone camera. The moment Eleanor Voss stood. The man in the royal lapel entering. The judge paling behind his bench. The tension in the air was almost visible in the frame, like heat rising from concrete. But it wasn't the judge's face that flooded social feeds. It was Isaac Ward, his stillness, his silence, the unwavering dignity of a man in full ceremonial uniform standing unshaken while power collapsed around him. Headlines didn't just report the event, they gave it a name. The man who didn't flinch. The story fractured across angles. Legal analysts dissected Langston's rulings over the years, tracing a pattern of silence where questions should have been raised. Ethics boards released cautious statements. Political commentators weighed in with feigned neutrality. But the public? The public didn't wait. Hashtags surged. Silent justice, guarded truth, Isaac Ward didn't blink. Memes popped up within hours, not mocking, but reverent. One viral image showed Isaac's expression beside the quote, "Some men carry swords, others carry silence." Outside the courthouse, the press gathered in clusters. The steps that had once trembled under protest chants now buzzed with microphones and reporters calling out for statements. Eleanor gave none. Isaac offered even less. He exited through a side door escorted not by guards, but by respect. An invisible circle of silence no one dared break. Cameras followed him anyway. He walked with quiet precision, each step a rejection of spectacle. In neighborhoods far from the courthouse, veterans watched the footage with straightened backs. One retired colonel wrote an open letter published online that night. "I spent 30 years in service, and never saw a man wear stillness like armor the way Isaac Ward does. He didn't expose a corrupt judge with fury. He dismantled him by not moving an inch." Children at school assemblies were shown the moment, not for gossip, but for character. Teachers paused the video just as Isaac passed the bench and asked, "What do you see?" One student replied, That's the kind of quiet that means something. But not everyone celebrated. Behind closed doors in government offices, questions circled like hawks. Who approved Isaac's presence in court? Was the monarchy involved? Had this been planned? The integrity unit remained silent, true to form. No press releases, no confirmations, just the sound of bureaucratic gears grinding behind frosted glass. In the midst of it all, Judge Langston disappeared from public view. His bench nameplate was removed, his chambers sealed. He issued no statement, gave no apology, but Isaac's silence, that echoed. An artist in Brixton painted a mural overnight, Isaac standing still, eyes ahead, the judge's shadow behind him crumbling into ash. The mural read, "Sometimes silence is a sword." It drew a crowd the next morning. People lit candles beneath it. Not because he was gone, but because something old had been honored, something rare. And while the world debated whether justice had been served or simply shaken, one thing was certain. Isaac Ward didn't speak. But now, no one could stop listening. Judge Edward Langston sat in the quiet of his once pristine study, the ticking of a grandfather clock now louder than anything he'd heard in the courtroom. The heavy velvet drapes were drawn tight, casting long shadows across the oak-paneled walls, lined with accolades, framed degrees, commendations, even a black-and-white photo of him shaking hands with a former prime minister. He stared at them like they belonged to someone else. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was invasive. And the worst part wasn't the inquiries or the headlines. It was that one image, replaying in his mind like a curse. The royal guard walking past him, head high, eyes steady, not a single word spoken, yet saying everything. The investigation was already underway. The Crown's legal board had frozen his judicial privileges. His staff had been reassigned. Even his access badge to the court had been revoked. The robe that once earned him hushed respect now hung limp in a garment bag by the door, its weight suddenly performative. Old colleagues stopped answering his calls. He hadn't heard from his political allies. Even the media outlets that once praised his courtroom demeanor now used words like bullying, manipulative, and exposed. He had underestimated the moment. He thought mocking a guard would play well to the gallery, that it would reaffirm his place in the hierarchy of public authority. He didn't realize he'd poked at something sacred. Isaac Ward wasn't just a man in red. He was a symbol of discipline, of tradition, of unshaken service. Langston had ridiculed what the country respected most, not just the institution of the Royal Guard, but the spirit behind it. And now, that same country was turning its back on him. Meanwhile, Isaac never gave an interview. He returned to duty as if the courtroom collapse had never happened. He stood at palace gates, at ceremonial marches, at the entrance of private state functions, the same as always. But when people passed him now, they didn't just glance. They paused. They looked longer, with reverence, with respect. Some nodded, some whispered thanks. He never responded. He didn't need to. Langston, pacing now, played out a dozen strategies in his head. Denial? Too late. Counterattack? Too dangerous. Sympathy? Laughable. Even the lawyers he once mentored were advising him to step down before the inquiry concluded. Resignation buys dignity, one had said. Dignity. That word stung more than he expected, because what Isaac had done, without saying a thing, was redefine the word entirely. Later that night, Langston found himself standing in front of a mirror, studying the lines in his face. The arrogance had drained, the sharpness dulled. In its place was something older. He wasn't a judge now. He wasn't even a voice of authority. He was just a man. And when he closed his eyes, the silence returned, but it didn't feel like his own. Back at the palace, an envelope had arrived for Isaac. No fanfare, no crest, just simple handwriting on aged parchment. Inside, a letter. Your silence held more weight than any gavel. The crown thanks you. It wasn't signed by a name, only initials. And somewhere in the city, a judge realized too late that the loudest room he'd ever stood in was the one where no one needed to speak to end him. The letter sat unopened on the small oak table by the window, where morning light spilled across Isaac Ward's modest flat. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant, deliberate, precise. It bore no seal, no title, just the initials at the bottom of the page. E.R. He hadn't needed to open it to understand what it was. Recognition, respect. A thank you from the highest voice in the land to the quietest. Still, he let it sit there, untouched, like a private truth he wasn't yet ready to claim. Instead, Isaac focused on the small things, polishing his boots, straightening his uniform, folding the same cloth over the same shoulder in the same practiced rhythm he'd followed for years. He hadn't asked for more. He hadn't stepped into that courtroom to make a point. He had simply stood his ground. And somehow, it changed everything. But now, everything had changed around him, without asking, without warning. There were invitations, requests, whispered conversations from people he didn't know knew his name. A royal commission wanted him on record. A public trust council offered him an honorary seat. Journalists requested interviews he never responded to, and then came the one that truly unsettled him. A private visit from a high-ranking official, asking if he'd consider stepping out of ceremonial service and into a newly created position. A liaison between the palace and the courts, internal ethics oversight. A voice of quiet integrity, the man had said, a presence that reminds people how power should behave. Isaac hadn't answered, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too well. He remembered standing outside the palace gates in the pouring rain, shoulders stiff, throat dry, while tourists snapped photos and diplomats were ushered through. He remembered the protest that turned violent, how he shielded a boy with his body, took a stone to the ribs, and kept standing. He remembered the silent funerals, the early mornings, the cold steel of discipline. He remembered the day his father died in service, and how no one had spoken his name in the news, because some men aren't built for noise. They're built for stillness, and stillness was sacred. He sat quietly by the window as the city moved outside. Buses rumbling, children laughing, a siren wailing in the distance. None of it asked for his attention, and yet it all felt connected now. He folded the letter gently, placed it inside a book, Letters from a Stoic, and slid it back onto the shelf, not because he wanted to hide it, but because its message was already inside him. He didn't need a desk. He didn't need a title. He just needed to keep standing, where it mattered most, later. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the polished floor of the guardhouse, Isaac stepped back into formation. No fanfare, no cameras, just duty. The changing of the guard proceeded as it always did. Precise, practiced, eternal. But those who looked closely noticed something different in the way people watched him now. A hush, not just of respect, but of reflection. A new generation of guards saw him as something more than tradition. He was proof that silence didn't mean absence. It meant awareness, patience, control. And when the palace official called again to ask if he'd considered the new role, Isaac replied with the only words he needed, "Not yet," because some men don't need to move forward to lead. Sometimes, just standing still is enough to change everything. The evening ceremony ended as it always did. Boots in rhythm, flags lowered, the guard's final turn executed with clockwork grace. But for those who stood quietly behind the barriers that day, something in the air felt different. Maybe it was the way the wind moved more softly across the courtyard, or how the fading sunlight lingered just long enough to frame one solitary figure in scarlet red. Isaac Ward stood at his post, unmoving, unshaken, timeless. No one spoke. Even the tourists, phones in hand, watched him in silence, almost reverently, as if they understood that the man before them had not just stood in history, but had shaped it, quietly, deliberately, without demanding to be seen. There would be no statue, no parade, no televised honor. But in the days that followed, something more powerful took root. Memory. A collective moment when a nation watched arrogance collapse, not under protest or rebellion, but beneath the weight of one man's unflinching presence. And from that moment, something shifted. Courtrooms became more cautious. Judges checked their tone. People questioned what dignity looked like, and realized it wasn't volume. It was restraint. In a small school in Kent, a teacher printed out a photo of Isaac in uniform, not to talk about the monarchy, but to explain the meaning of poise. "This," she said, "is how you carry truth without shouting. This is what strength looks like when it doesn't need a sword." In a youth center in Birmingham, a teenage boy who'd been caught in fights began showing up to sessions again. When asked why, he simply replied, "Because I saw a man in red who didn't swing back, and still won." Back at the palace, the Integrity Committee quietly expanded. No headlines, no announcements. But for the first time, their internal training module included a new section: the power of presence. Lessons from the Ward silence. And Isaac? He remained where he was, guarding the gates, attending ceremonies, slipping through the day like a shadow with substance. Occasionally, someone would pass him and whisper a thank you. He never responded, never looked. But the way he stood, just a little straighter, just a moment longer, was answer enough. He never told anyone what it felt like in the courtroom that day, what it was like to be mocked, then watched, then witnessed. He didn't have to. His silence was never about retreat. It was a decision, a boundary, a mirror, and in holding it, he forced the world to look at itself. At a public lecture on justice 6 months later, a retired judge referenced Isaac without naming him. He paused mid-speech and said, "Some men are remembered for what they say in defense, but there's a rarer kind, the ones remembered for how they stood when others didn't." So now, as the final bells rang and the courtyard dimmed, Isaac Ward stood under the evening sky, still in uniform, still in silence. But his stillness had echoed far beyond the gates. It had reached the hearts of people who had never worn red, never held a line, but had all stood at the edge of being dismissed, and found in him a reminder that stillness is not weakness. It is will, it is knowing, and it asks us all one quiet question: when the time comes, will you speak, or will you dare to stand?